Mr. President, today we hope to vote on a bipartisan, bicameral agreement that will fully fund the government and provide additional measures to strengthen our border security. I want to applaud all of the members of the conference committee who worked on this agreement. I particularly want to recognize those Senate members and led by Chairman Shelby and Vice Chairman Leahy for negotiating a bipartisan compromise that will keep the government's doors open. Neither side got everything they wanted. That's why it's called a compromise. But in the end, fully funding the government and keeping it open is what's best for the American people. What we saw during the 35-day government shutdown was that it took a terrible toll on our federal workers, and it cost the U.S. economy $11 billion, including $3 billion that's gone forever, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Across the country, federal workers have been very anxiously waiting to see if we were going to come to an agreement, if they were going to be able to continue to pay their mortgages, afford groceries, get their prescriptions. Well, today, hopefully, we can put their minds at ease. We can pass this legislation, and hopefully the President will sign it. Because failure to do so would once again deprive Americans of important government services and throw our economy into a tailspin. So I urge all of our colleagues in Congress to take up this funding legislation, to pass it, and the President to sign it as soon as it reaches his desk. Protecting our borders should not be an exercise in partisanship, and I'm glad to see that this bill supports common sense investments that focus on the technology, infrastructure, and personnel that are needed at the southern and northern borders to provide actual security that works. The bill provides $1.375 billion for targeted fencing in vulnerable areas along the southern border, and more than $800 million for Border Patrol agents, better surveillance, and screening technologies, and increased security at our ports of entry. When resourced and deployed appropriately, these types of smart investments are far more likely to interrupt the flow of narcotics than a costly and ineffective border wall. Importantly, the legislation also includes $77 million for opioid equipment and staffing to interdict fentanyl and other synthetic opioids that are shipped through international mail and express consignment facilities. And this is particularly important to states like mine, New Hampshire, where we have the second highest overdose death rate from opioids in the country. And so many of those deaths are caused by the synthetic fentanyl. The opioid epidemic is a true national emergency, and federal investments like these are what's needed to stop the illegal flow of these drugs into the country. Now, when Congress takes up and passes this deal, it will not only pass the appropriations bill for the Department of Homeland Security, but also 6 other appropriations bills that have unfortunately been waylaid by our shutdown. This appropriations package supports critical federal investments across all government agencies, and I want to highlight just a few of those, starting with the programs funded in the bipartisan Commerce, Justice, and Science and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill for the fiscal year 2019. As ranking member of the CJS subcommittee, I work closely with my colleague, Senator Moran from Kansas, who chairs the subcommittee, and we crafted what I believe is a truly bipartisan bill that will promote the economy, protect the American people, and secure our nation's leadership in science and innovation. For example, the fiscal year 19 CJS bill provides $468 million in dedicated Justice Department grant programs to tackle the opioid epidemic. The legislation will provide funding to state and local governments and those organizations working on the front lines, providing a balanced approach of law enforcement, treatment, and recovery resources to help our communities who are dealing with opioid and fentanyl deaths. This amount is $21 million higher than the FY18 level and $336 million higher than the President's budget request. For communities desperately fighting the opioid addiction, any further delay in funding is dangerous and could be deadly. So it's critical that we pass this bill today. Importantly, the legislation also contains the highest funding level ever for the Office of Violence Against Women, $497.5 million for critical programs that provide training for police officers and prosecutors, rape prevention programs, and funding for women's shelters. While I'm glad that the appropriations package provides funding for these Violence Against Women Act programs, more work needs to be done to better support survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address the complex issue of domestic violence. Now, the appropriations package also supports investments in our national infrastructure and provides more than $49 billion to the Federal Highway Administration to modernize our highways and repair our bridges. This legislation would also provide a $1.3 billion increase for housing programs like rental assistance and homeless support services. And for us in New Hampshire, that means that 9,500 low-income households will continue to have a place that they can call home. I'm pleased that the appropriations package includes a 1.9% pay increase for federal civilian employees. This is a cost of living increase that is long overdue. You know, during the shutdown, I had a chance to meet with a number of our federal workers. And one of the things that impressed me the most was the dedication that those workers had to their jobs and to serving the people of this country. They were going to work without getting paid, without knowing when they were going to get paid. And yet they showed up every day because of their commitment to the people of this country. Now, in addition to passing the appropriations package, Congress should take further action to provide financial security to federal employees and contractors. And we just heard our colleague Tina Smith talking about the importance of providing the pay to those people who so far are not slated to get back pay. I've co-sponsored legislation to secure back pay for the federal contractor employees, including janitorial, food, and security services workers who were furloughed or forced to accept reduced work hours as a result of the shutdown. I hope that we in Congress will take up and pass the bills that Senator Smith outlines as soon as possible. Now, Mr. President, I know you know this because we've talked about it. But Americans are tired of partisanship. They expect their elected officials to work together, to come to a bipartisan compromise, and to do what's good for the country. And I couldn't agree more. The Senate will soon consider an appropriations package to supply federal investments for programs that support national defense, small businesses, conservation of public lands, food assistance for low-income families, and so much more. This is a package that also includes compromise proposals to improve our border security. I hope we will pass this package this afternoon and that the President will sign this legislation into law as soon as it passes the House. Federal workers are dedicated to serving the American people, and they have families to care for. They should never again be used as pawns. We should never again use shutting down the federal government as an excuse over disagreements around policy issues. It is time for us as elected leaders to move away from this partisan politics, to live up to the expectations of our constituents. Let's fund the government, and let's do it today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.